Today we're going to talk about demand, quantity demanded, and price. Demand is the entire relationship between price and how much people buy. Quantity demanded tells you how much people buy at one particular price, and price is, of course, how much money you have to part with in order to get a good. A demand curve shows you the entire relationship between price and quantity demanded. Any one point on that curve is saying for a particular price, here's how many goods people want to buy. So we know from the graph in front of us, if the price of widgets is $10, people want to buy 100 widgets. A demand curve is usually a market demand curve and shows the demand for some market. It could be a city, a country, or the whole world, depending upon what you care about. So this could be a demand curve for widgets for a city, and if the price is 10, then every day people might want to buy 100 widgets. Demand curves always have negative slopes, and this is called the law of demand. Demand curves have negative slopes because there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, which just means if the price of something goes up, people tend to want to buy less of it. But as the price of something goes down, people want to buy more of it. You like money because money is useful for getting, lots of neat things. So if suddenly to get a good, you have to give up more money, you're going to be less interested in buying the good, or you're going to want to buy less of a good. I'm sure in most of your own lives, you've thought you wanted to buy a good, but then found out the price is higher than you thought, so you decided you wouldn't get the good. When you decrease the price of a good, you move along that good's demand curve. So in the example before you, if we cut the price of widgets from 10 to 5, we move from point A to point B on the demand curve, and the quantity demanded of widgets goes up from 100 to 220. Now, it's important to understand that this did not change the demand for widgets, and this is purely because of definition. We define demand as the entire relationship between price and quantity. So we haven't changed the relationship between price and quantity. In essence, the demand for widgets is this entire line. So when you move along the line, you haven't changed the line. When you move from A to B, you don't change the demand for widgets. What you do is you change the quantity demanded of widgets, because quantity demanded is just a number. It's like saying you want 220 widgets, whereas the demand for widgets is the entire relationship between price and quantity and is given by the whole line, whereas the quantity demanded of widgets is just a single point. All right, let's look at the demand curve for Pepsi. And let's imagine we're at point A, where the price of Pepsi is $1, and at this price, people in our city buy 50,000 cans of Pepsi every day. What happens if the price of Coke increases? Well, if the price of Pepsi had increased, we know we would just move along the demand curve for Pepsi. But I haven't changed the price of Pepsi. I'm telling you what changes is the price of Coke. Now, the price of Coke is going to affect how much Pepsi people want to buy. You can imagine if we make the price of Coke really, really expensive, people who used to drink Coke are going to switch to Pepsi. So we clearly, if we increase the price of Coke, we're not going to stay at A, but we're also not allowed to just move along the demand curve, because when you move along the demand curve, that's just saying what happens when you change the price of Pepsi. We've got to do something else. What we do is we move to an entirely new demand curve for Pepsi. When you draw a demand curve, that curve is two-dimensional and is only able to show you the relationship between two things. In the case of a demand curve for Pepsi, that's the price of Pepsi and how much Pepsi people want to buy. But let's say we change something else that affects how much Pepsi people want to buy. We need an entirely new line. We need to move to an entirely new demand curve. There's different demand curves if the price of Coke is low and if the price of Coke is high. I think it makes sense to assume that for any given price of Pepsi, people will buy more Pepsi if the price of Coke is high than if the price of Coke is low. So if we keep the price of Pepsi the same, say $1, but we make Coke more expensive, then we're going to move from A to B. We move to a new demand curve, and we have a higher quantity demanded of Pepsi. So to review, if all we do is increase the price of Pepsi, then we move along the demand curve for Pepsi. We don't change the demand for Pepsi, but we do change the quantity demanded of Pepsi. That's because the demand for Pepsi is the entire relationship between the price of Pepsi and the quantity of Pepsi, whereas the quantity demanded of Pepsi is a number, like 300 cans of Pepsi. And if you change the price of Pepsi, you do change the quantity demanded for Pepsi. In contrast, if we change the price of Coke, then we have to move to an entirely new demand curve for Pepsi, and we get both the new demand curve for Pepsi and a new quantity demanded of Pepsi. I know it probably seems annoying to have to keep track of this terminology, but a lot of microeconomics builds on demand curves, and so getting a solid understanding of these definitions is going to help you keep up with more advanced material. Thank you for listening.